December 1872. The freezing expanse of the Atlantic. A ship drifts silently through the heavy fog. The sails are set, but no one is guiding the vessel. A boarding party approaches the dark wooden hull. The silence is deafening. They climb over the rails, expecting a massacre. Instead, they find the impossible. No blood, no signs of a struggle. In the captain's cabin, a logbook lies open. A half-eaten meal sits abandoned in the dark. Deep in the cargo hold, the ship's valuable freight is perfectly stacked and completely untouched. This was no pirate attack. At the helm, the wheel turns entirely alone. 10 people simply evaporated into the ocean air. What happened on the Mary Celeste? The calendar read December 4th, 1872. Captain David Morehouse, commanding the merchant ship Dei Gratia, was fighting the brutal swells of the North Atlantic. The ocean was a cold, unforgiving gray desert. Then, the lookout shouted. Miles away, a dark silhouette cut through the heavy mist. It was a ship, but there was something deeply wrong with how she moved. The vessel lumbered like a wounded giant. Her sails were set in utter chaos, some fully hoisted, others torn and violently snapping against the masts in the freezing wind. She wasn't sailing. She was wandering blindly. Morehouse raised his spyglass. Through the salt-streaked lens, he recognized the dark, heavy wooden hull. It was the Mary Celeste, a ship that had departed the port of New York 8 days before him. For 2 agonizing hours, the Dei Gratia shadowed the vessel. No distress signals, no flags waving, no movement on the deck. The silence radiating from that weathered wood was more disturbing than the crash of the waves. Experienced sailors know when tragedy is resting on the water. Flares were fired. The sound echoed and died in the fog. Nothing. The Mary Celeste continued her ghostward drift. Morehouse lowered his glass and made the only call left. He dispatched his chief mate, Oliver DeVoe, and a small boarding party in a rowboat. The small craft rose and fell in the treacherous water, inching closer to the silent wooden monster. DeVoe grabbed the wet rigging and pulled himself up. When his boots hit the freezing deck, the absolute emptiness swallowed them. The air smelled of salt, damp wood, and pure abandonment. The nightmare wasn't in the Atlantic waters. It was right there on board. The boarding party stepped softly. Every creak of the floorboards echoed like a gunshot in the dead air. Chief Mate DeVoe led his men below deck, bracing for a massacre. He expected blood, broken furniture, the violent aftermath of a pirate raid. Instead, they found the impossible. Perfect, haunting order. In the main cabin, a bed was unmade, holding the shape of someone who had just woken up. A rosewood harmonium stood quietly in the corner, sheet music still resting on the stand. Nearby, a sewing machine sat idle, a piece of fabric still pinned under the needle. And on the floor, a child's toys. Captain Benjamin Briggs had brought his wife, Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia, on this voyage. Their personal belongings, their clothes, their money, everything was completely undisturbed. The men moved to the galley. The ship was heavily stocked. There was enough food and fresh water left to comfortably feed the entire crew for 6 full months, untouched. Then they opened the massive cargo hold. Deep in the freezing belly of the ship sat 1,700 heavy wooden barrels of raw industrial alcohol. An absolute fortune in 1872. If pirates had taken the vessel, this hold would have been stripped bare. But the cargo was perfectly stacked. DeVoe stood in the cold shadows of the hold. A chilling realization washed over his crew. this wasn't piracy. This wasn't a bloody mutiny. The crew hadn't been robbed. 10 people had simply vanished into thin air. But if the hull was perfectly sound and the cargo was safe, why leave? DeVoe and his men scoured the captain's quarters for answers. They found the ship's logbook resting quietly on a wooden desk. The final entry was dated November 24th, 10 agonizing days before the Dei Gratia found them drifting. The handwriting was calm, precise, and entirely routine. It noted their coordinates near the Azores Islands. No mention of a rogue storm, no mention of a leak, no hint of impending doom. Yet a closer look around the freezing room revealed the chilling reality of their departure. This was no accident. It was a panicked, desperate evacuation. The ship's chronometer and sextant, the absolute essential tools for navigating the open ocean, were gone. The captain's most crucial papers were missing. And then, the men looked over the stern of the ship. Trailing in the freezing gray water was a thick, frayed rope. It was the ship's main peak halyard. It hadn't just come untied. The thick fibers were violently shredded. It had snapped under immense pressure. Finally, they looked at the main hatch. The ship's only lifeboat, a small, fragile wooden yawl that should have been strapped to the deck, was gone. Picture the sheer terror of that moment. Captain Benjamin Briggs, a veteran sailor who had spent his entire life on the water, suddenly orders his wife, his toddler, and his seasoned crew to abandon a perfectly safe, fully stocked vessel. He throws them into a tiny wooden rowboat in the middle of the unforgiving Atlantic, ties a rope to the massive mothership, and prays. What invisible monster could possibly terrify a captain enough to make that fatal choice? For over a century, ghost stories filled the void left by the Mary Celeste. But modern maritime historians point to a terrifying reality: a perfect storm of chemistry, miscalculation, and human panic. Look closely at the cargo hold. 1,700 barrels of crude industrial alcohol. Shipping records show that 9 of those massive red oak casks were later found completely empty. Not leaked, vaporized. Imagine the deep, dark belly of the ship. The Atlantic temperature shifts, the pressure builds. Highly flammable, invisible alcohol vapor fills the confined space. A sudden, violent rumble. A rush of hot air blasts the heavy hatch covers off. To Captain Briggs, standing on the deck with his wife and child, the scent of alcohol is overwhelming. The ship feels like a ticking bomb, seconds away from a catastrophic explosion. But there was a second, hidden killer aboard. On its previous voyage, the Mary Celeste had carried coal. Fine, abrasive coal dust still coated the deepest parts of the hull. Historians believe this dark sludge completely clogged the ship's water pumps. Picture the absolute chaos of that moment. The captain smells explosive vapor rising from below. He rushes to check the bilge water, but the pumps are jammed with coal slurry. In the middle of a rough sea, blinded by the freezing mist, an experienced captain makes a fatal miscalculation. He believes his ship is simultaneously about to explode and actively sinking. Raw survival instinct takes over. He orders the immediate evacuation. But what the weigh a captain enough to make that fatal choice? The 10 souls scrambled into the tiny wooden yawl. They tied the thick peak halyard to the Mary Celeste's stern. The plan was likely simple: trail behind at a safe distance, wait for the explosive vapors to clear, board again when the danger had passed. But the North Atlantic in December has no mercy. A sudden winter squall hits the water. The massive, chaotic sails of the empty Mary Celeste catch the violent wind. The heavy ship surges forward with immense force. The tow line pulls taut. The water churns. And then, a sickening crack. The thick rope snaps. In the freezing, blinding rain, Captain Briggs, his wife, his baby girl, and 7 seasoned sailors are left behind. Imagine that exact, terrifying moment. Sitting in a fragile, open shell of wood, hundreds of miles from land, watching your fully stocked, perfectly safe sanctuary drift away into the gray fog. They realized in their final hours that they had abandoned the very thing that would have saved them. The Mary Celeste didn't kill her crew. The ocean did. The ghost ship sailed on for another 10 days without a living soul at the helm, a silent monument to a fatal miscalculation. Sometimes, the most terrifying monsters aren't supernatural. They are just human panic, a snapped rope, and the endless, freezing abyss.